In recent times, many have discussed Elemental and the apparent box office bomb that it opened to. That, and how I and many others weren't convinced before watching the movie about what it was, and that reflected in its opening weekend. A film that seemingly did not have the right marketing going into it at all. And as I saw recently, I actually went out liking the film, and many others actually agreed with that, while some also disagreed and didn't like it. Not outright hate it, but just wasn't their cup of tea. Where, in my case, I've been slowly but surely appreciating the film more and more, and is seeing that right now with a minor box office recovery. Because as we all know, Pixar is quite in a rough spot. Films like Lightyear were an absolute disaster for the studio, Return being a box office bomb and not being a good film either. It's not bad because Pixar rarely makes bad films except for Cars 2, but it just seems so idealist, marketing off of existing IP and failing in every single way in the public. Where before that, you had releases like Turning Red and Luca, which weren't given much theatrical releases, where they just dumped Pixar movies on Disney Plus without any care, which are actually far better stories than Lightyear, even though movies like Turning Red weren't exactly my taste. But still appreciated the film with what they were trying to provide overall, and was something that probably deserved our actual release in theaters. Because recently, Elemental has actually surpassed Lightyear's entire box office run, despite having a worse opening of any Pixar film that was in fact lower than Lightyear's, proving how much people have actually taken a liking to it, a situation where I would like to present as Elemental's comeback, where as we all know, many people have already discussed its opening being the most disappointing failure in all of Pixar history, where now that hasn't actually become the case. Now this isn't going to say that this movie is going to make money at all, far from it, where it needs like $500 million to do so, which is possible, but still very hard. But at the very least, as of this moment, with the trajectory the film is going through, it would actually break even, because at the time of writing this, the film domestically has crossed over $100 million, the highest grossing original animated film since 2018, and something of Disney's highest grossing film since Frozen 2, which isn't saying much because of the crap they've been producing. And that is a fact that is absolutely brilliant, showcasing that there is an entire audience excited for new stories in an age where most films that have made an amount of money consist of sequels and remakes and other films based upon IP. And we also should keep in mind the fact that it hasn't fully released internationally, not exactly releasing in Japan as of this recording until August, which would actually boost its numbers from this very date as well. And the reason I really wanted to talk about this is because of the reception in other parts of the world like Korea, because in South Korea, the film has exploded at their very box office, with the most positive word of mouth out of every single country increasing week to week before slowing down as of this recording, with bigger films released as of this moment like Mission Impossible. And the major reason for this is because of director Peter Sohn, a good guy who has voiced many favorite Pixar side characters like Emil from Ratatouille, Squishy from Monsters University, and Socks from Lightyear, while also cameoing in Across the Spider-Verse as Miles' roommate Gank Lee, where in fact, that was a movie that was also co-directed by Kemp Powers, who also co-directed Pixar's Soul with Pete Docter, which is really neat to learn and a respect that the animators have to help each other out no matter the studio, whether it be Sony or Pixar or whatever. But besides that, the point we're trying to make here is that Peter Sohn is actually Korean American and the son of Korean immigrants who he actually dedicated the film to, who both passed during the making of this film, really adding more to most of the elements of the film that tried to present. Because this story does begin with two people actually coming to this new city and trying to settle a life for themselves, just like his own parents. And there are various elements in the film that actually relate and connect with the Korean traditions, as what I researched, including interviews that Peter did with several big Korean channels, really adding to how much they actually loved the film, making you appreciate the decisions the movie actually took more. Not that it makes everything I found not as good actually good now, I still have a problem with some of the things that are presented in the movie, but at the very least I know now what it actually pertains to, hence its newfound success in places like Korea that make them love the film. Well, that and of course Disney's own pathetic marketing of Claude after the film's initial disappointed opening weekend. Definitely the greatest strategy Disney has ever done, even if the film won't make money overall. But besides that, it really demonstrates something we all take for granted at face value, all because of the initial marketing of the movie. This is something I fell into myself with my initial Pixar videos and Elemental videos, talking about what is happening, which of course leads down to Disney's own fault the more and more I research into it, especially what the CEO actually said recently. I really think he remains responsible for most of the crappy decisions as of this late in Disney, including making more sequels and remakes as the years passed. Because the problem that was originally presented was the trailers themselves giving something that felt weird for Pixar to do with something that looked like a cliche generic story that really didn't catch people's attention, including using elements that are separate and cannot mix, which doesn't make any sense within that context comparing that to real life elements and how they do mix. And while the film has some of the cliche problems you expect knowing that they do have a romance, it really wasn't that and was actually focused on something quite charming instead. Because the real heart of the movie is actually found in the relationship of Ember's family, once again tying back into Peter Sellon's own experience with his parents and what they did when they immigrated here to America. It's a movie more based upon thanking them for what they did rather than the initial thoughts of a forbidden love in a Romeo-Juliet type style. Of course, trying to tie back into the racial experiences of moving to a different country and trying to set yourself apart from that. Of course, when you put it into the context of this film and other Disney films, it really doesn't work quite as well, but at least it's admirable with what they tried to do. It's something I still can't wait to explore in a future video when it does come out on Disney Plus because of the fact I've learned so much and see the heart that actually comes from it. It is just clear that we've entered a new age where people are just tired of the lazy corporation that Disney and other studios are that are drumming up these mediocre movies and franchises without little care for actually making a good story. That and prices that are going up that they don't care about when pertaining to how people actually go to watch a movie experience. This is where we have to bring up the failure known as Lightyear and what they tried to do returning to theaters with the spin-off that milks off their most profitable, beloved franchise. It carries nothing of emotional value to what is being adapted, and the story really did feel uninspired with what it tried to do in that way. How it really doesn't feel like what Pixar would usually produce that is connectable because it continues to be based upon something that already exists while feeling like it actually shouldn't. The elements of this very film is actually pathetic. It isn't an outright bad experience, but still hinges on trying to capitalize off a popular character from a movie series that should be concluded at this very point. One where it already had an entire series that was far more compelling to how the character is rather than how the bland tone of this movie actually provides for him. I mean, the animation is good and great and realistic for what they tried to do so, but that doesn't mean it helped the story in any way. I didn't like the villain, and I certainly couldn't care less with the heroes, especially Buzz himself, and that really doesn't make sense coming from a studio known as Pixar, the one that usually creates masterpieces and rarely an actual bad film and actual heart that the main characters go on. And general audiences really felt that when it was released in theaters, only making $226 million in its entire run. How us here in the States and internationally around the world, people just didn't really care for it. Something Elemental has already surpassed too, about 4 weeks into its release in theaters, with other markets still waiting for their own release. It's just how you cannot go making the film with one intention at first and then putting out the story second. It just doesn't work like that, and most of the blame on that fact is on Disney themselves for making it this way. Why should we return to theaters with crap like this when the previous films released during the same year and time frame like Turning Red provide a better experience? Like, that film is far superior than Lightyear, only released on Disney Plus, only a few months before Lightyear was due to return in theaters, when theaters were opened up more so than in 2021 when popular films like Encanto still made over $250 million despite being affected by COVID somewhat and getting popular on streaming after. How they just have conditioned people to wait until this new age of streaming rather than trying to connect with the theatrical experience most people used to enjoy. How they just set themselves up for failure because they stopped caring about the quality, where the quality itself is being minimized rather than giving any attention. The focus on quantity and stuff like Marvel and Star Wars and Disney themselves rather than the passion that these topics actually present to us. Because movies like Lightyear seem better suited to be released on Disney Plus because of those facts. How you can have tons of Marvel and Star Wars properties getting new shows so quickly, and how Pixar has released tons of shorts to be watched on there. The distinction and expectation that happens relies on how it's being presented, and the more Disney does this, the more they dilute Pixar's ability to try and tell stories that they actually want to tell. Or if you removed Lightyear from that complete equation, then you think Elemental would have a far better success. People would actually like it because they didn't have to deal with the crap they've actually returned to. And that's what happened when Elemental opened up to the lowest weekend they've had since Toy Story came out. A situation I expect Disney does not want, where the word of mouth have actually came to save the movie in theaters, and it shows. Showing how the world is actually reacting positively because of what the movie is doing once again to connect to the audiences like they did before. Mentioning Korea once again, where Elemental is literally on pace to surpass Inside Out as its highest grossing Pixar film released there, and on pace to also become the highest grossing animated film of the year, close to films like Suzume and The First Slam Dunk, two anime films from Japan that became very popular in Korea, which is really saying something to how the movie is connecting well with those audiences. It shows how people shouldn't be just rushing into judging the films on the opening weekend solely based upon the reception, where Elemental is already on pace to surpass other films like The Flash that opened during the same weekend worldwide, a film that also opened higher than Elemental in that same time frame, where we've entered a summer stacked with most movies that now have supremely high budgets and are not going to even make any money. This is the fact where some people of course try to spin the news in the more negative light because their channels bank off of that negative attention without seeing the movie at all or anything else. An opinion people are still having about the movie without seeing it for what it is, whether you can connect with it or not like any other movie. And how marketing a movie can really affect the perception overall when we saw this with Treasure Planet and quite possibly Atlantis too, becoming such underrated classics now that people hold in high regard. And how once again in the case of Encanto it had popped off on streaming on the internet. The same would probably happen with this film when it gets released too, and what we are seeing now that is surpassing Lightyear. How this actually presents a sad reality that is, when something doesn't go well for Disney initially, they stopped caring about it, unlike Frozen that keeps getting shoved down our throats because of its very success, and how it continued to do so, making billions of dollars instead of films like Elemental that have far more passion and love for it. I mean, yes, the third act has a lot of problems too for me, but it doesn't stop me from enjoying it and the background that went into it. Elemental might not be an overall success by the end, but it still provides that there is a reason for Pixar to be enjoyed, and how Disney as a whole needs to wipe everyone who's actually running the company into the ground, forgetting that these stories are the ones that need to be told that come out from a place of passion. That the only way they'll ever learn is if they start promoting these stories once again for the better, to believe in it, because Walt Disney certainly believed in making his stories back then work, so why shouldn't they actually do that now? Because the more they don't, the more they start to fail overall because of what they're doing, focusing and pandering on certain topics. And what I want to take away from this is the fact that films like Elemental prove how films should be judged by how the project turns out, and how the studio fails to notice these problems every single time, resulting in an overall failure of interest to start based upon what they do. With that said, I had a fun time learning and appreciating something more than what has been provided, and how I apologize for my initial reception of Elemental that deserves to have a positive chance to be shown. And I'm all done, so goodbye.